Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 596 for the 15th of March 2020. Richard Saunders coming to you this week from Sydney, Australia. And it's a different world from even this time last week. What a different world it is. And as we know, we don't look into the future. We can guess, I guess, what's going to happen. But yes, welcome to the different world. We will be covering the virus situation briefly on today's Skeptic Zone. I don't want to fill up too many hours over the next weeks with it, although who knows. I thought I might give you other things to listen to. We'll get it over and done with in the first segment, which is the reading of a press release from the Australian Skeptics about this weekend's Mind, Body, Spirit Festival in Sydney, which, despite advice, still went ahead. And the reason Australian skeptics were concerned enough to make a press release is that a Mind, Body, Spirit festival would be a magnet for anti-vaxxers and people who have a very poor understanding of basic science, such as germ theory. And in the press release, you'll hear the mention of a medical diagnostic tool. And this, to name it, is the Metatron. It's a Russian thing. It's a computer program that appears to show you a scan of your body. And one of the claims made is it can zap viruses. This is an appalling situation that these things have been peddled out over the last few years regardless. And maybe after this is all settled down, we can take some serious action against people who claim they can scan your body with Star Trek technology and zap viruses. Anyway, that's coming up at the top of the show. After that, it's a special guest, Dick Smith, the famous entrepreneur and adventurer in Australia. He's the man who flew a helicopter around the world solo. He flew a helicopter to the North Pole. He piloted a balloon from Australia to New Zealand. He has had a lifetime of adventures. And he was one of the founders of Australian Skeptics. Maynard caught up with Dick Smith a couple of weeks ago at the Australian Skeptics dinner meeting. And it's a wide-ranging discussion with Dick, mostly about climate change and other matters like population. Following that, it's Logical Fallacies with Michelle Bickersma. This week, Michelle looks at straw man. In fact, I think it's one of the very early ones I can remember hearing about. Straw man this week. After that, it's an update from our friend Susan Gerbic from Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia. Then to round off the show, Michelle Franklin, Life is Wild, Invasive Species, looking at horses. Yes, sometimes we think about insects or rats or something, but in Australia, horses are an invasive species. But now it's time for me to run out the door, wash my hands, oh yes, run downstairs, have a look in the fridge. I wonder if there's any chocolate left. It's a good old standby, isn't it? In fact, I noticed the other day when I was in the supermarket, keeping my distance from everybody, but chocolate seems to be selling very well at the moment. Chocolate and toilet paper, I think there's a message there. Well, I do that. I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. For many years, as regular Skeptic Zone listeners will know, we've been reporting from the Festival of Mind, Body, Spirit, or as we call it, of course, all together now, Mind, Body, Wallet. And this is every 6 months here in Sydney and around the country, major cities, Brisbane, Melbourne, I think Adelaide too. This is the first time, for me personally, in almost 2 decades, that I will not be attending the Mind, Body, Wallet this time around. And there's a very good reason for this, and I We'll read now from a press release issued by the Australian Skeptics on March the 12th, 2020. New Age pseudoscience is no match for COVID-19 by Tim Mendham. In a break with decades-long tradition, members of Australian Skeptics will not be attending this weekend's Mind, Body, Spirit exhibition in Sydney's Darling Harbour due to the dangers of the spread of COVID-19 and the ignorant attitudes of some exhibitors. Attending would put our members at risk. Many of the pseudoscientific modalities on display reject basic scientific concepts such as germ theory and pathogen transmission. We do not trust some of the exhibitors to understand the seriousness of the viral outbreak and the need for rigorous hygiene. When exhibitors deny that there are such things as germs and they are opposed to vaccination, then how could they offer anything that is not useless or dangerous? Some, such as the rabidly anti-vaccine group Australian Vaccination Risks Network, have even suggested that COVID-19 does not exist, but is, quote, just a bad cold, end quote. In the past, we have uncovered various medical testing machines which seem to do no real analysis and have no medical benefit at all. Given what we are now facing, such equipment is nothing short of outrageous. Quote, not attending Mind, Body, Spirit is an extraordinary step for us, end quote, said Tim Mendham, Executive Officer for Australian Skeptics Inc. Quote, many of our members have been regularly attending the exhibition of New Age and alternative products and services for years. We have taken great interest in the goods on show and have had interesting discussions with various suppliers about the methodology and efficacy of what they are offering. But because of the current situation with COVID-19 and the fact that at least some exhibitors have a minimal understanding or even antipathy to the scientific and medical issues involved, we are forced to make this move. Note, we are not asking that the exhibition be closed. We just feel that the public should be aware that some of the exhibitors at Mind, Body, Spirit have views that are diametrically opposed to the best evidence-based scientific and medical knowledge and an attitude that could be dangerous, end quote. The New Age is no match for a real medical threat. Of course, one of the downsides about not going to Mind, Body, Wallet this time around is hearing firsthand some of the outrageously dangerous advice that you can normally hear there. But this time, with the current situation with the coronavirus, the COVID-19, I just dread to think what sort of nonsense is being spouted there. And that press release can be found at skeptics.com.au with a link in this week's show notes.
Hola, les habla Paula desde la hermosa ciudad de Buenos Aires, en Argentina. Cuando escuchamos podcasts, escuchamos los mismos que escucha todo el mundo, como The Skeptic Zone. Ojalá puedan venir a visitarnos algún día. Los esperamos con nuestras riquísimas comidas locales y hasta podemos ir a bailar un tango. Mientras tanto, sigan disfrutando de su dosis semanal de ciencia y pensamiento racional. ¡Chao!
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
Look, someone who's always great fun to bump into is Dick Smith. Hi, Dick, how are you?
How are things?
Oh, well, it's pretty good. You certainly got out of retail at a good time, didn't you?
Yeah, I was very lucky, wasn't I? Maybe I can look into the future.
Yes, quite well indeed. In fact, would you ever suggest anyone get into retail selling anything at this point in time?
Not at the moment. I've advised people to get out. Look, Amazon is going to have an incredible effect because they just got such low overheads. The only reason Jeff Bezos is the wealthiest person on earth is he knows a way of making money and employing the lowest number of people possible.
That's true. And he's got the little fingers wrapped around the governments too there with those subsidies in the US as well.
Absolutely. No, he's very astute. You have to hand it to him.
And of course, what do you think? Why do you think people are slow to accept the climate change information that they're confronted with? Why do they deny it or they go, look, I don't know about that?
I have a famous expression, that is, the human power to self-delude is unlimited. But the reason many people deny the climate change issue is that it's so complex. And then also there's some very vocal people saying it's all rubbish, it's all made up. And they're persuasive people. And because of that coupling up, it's interesting, I've got three groups of friends. I've got my middle-of-the-range friends, and they basically believe in human-induced climate change. Then I've got my lefty friends who are utterly convinced. But on the right side, I've got my right-wing friends who are all climate change deniers. Now, all of these people are genuine in their beliefs. Some are wrong, of course. But what you can do about it, I think there's going to have to be some major crash, some Hitler walk into Poland moment where we all have to do something. Otherwise, it's going to be like the frog being heated in the water. We're not going to do anything.
Do you think the coronavirus incident could be something that promotes that crash?
No, I don't think so. I think the coronavirus might have an effect on our economic system, which I've always thought is going to crash at some time. But when it comes to climate change, no. I thought the bushfires would have a real effect, but they're now almost forgotten by many people. They're now, the rains have come, everything's okay. And one of the problems is many of the people who preach and talk about climate change make out as if it's going to be an easy problem to solve. It is not going to be. So David Attenborough is 100% correct where he said it's going to require enormous sacrifice. And no politician is game enough to get up and say we're all going to have to sacrifice.
Well, it mainly means a loss of job in certain sectors like mining and industry. It's going to be a loss in those sectors, yeah.
Well, or move the jobs. It has to be planned. See, one of the problems is we sell $100 billion worth of fossil fuels every year. Now, our economy will collapse without those sales, so they have to be replaced with something. Personally, I believe we should be looking at nuclear energy. I'm pro-renewables, but I don't believe the statement where people say renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels. That's simply not true. They are cheaper when the sun is out and when the wind is blowing. But because we don't have a low-cost method of storage, they become very expensive when you look at, say, 1 year of output.
Although if you look at the lifetime of a nuclear plant, including the clean-up and all the possibility of storage, maybe that's more expensive than renewables.
No, I see, the problem is the renewables are intermittent. We don't have a successful way of storing them. The battery price needs to come down 40 times, not 40%, 40 times to be competitive with fossil fuels.
How about the occasional gas-powered plant? I mean, yes, CO2, but not as much.
No, I don't accept that at all because we're doubling our population. So if you change to gas, we're going to have 50% the amount of carbon, but we're doubling our population. We have one of the highest population growths in the developed world. That means we're back where we started from. No, gas is not the way. My belief...
Pump hydro, Dick? Pump hydro?
No way. That's the most dangerous form. You wouldn't want to live below a hydro dam because they collapse. The worst one in the world is 25,000 died in China when a hydro dam collapsed. In America, I think it was over 100. There's no way that I'd want to live below a pump storage dam because of the risk of it collapsing.
Wow. And of course, you mentioned population growth there, and that's one thing I've always liked about you is you've been someone that's tried to promote a conversation, and that's pretty difficult. I mean, climate change is also a difficult one. Do you think population control is even harder to talk about?
It's more important because every problem we have in the world today is harder to fix with more people. And the fact that the United Nations has no plan about population, we're going from 7 to 11 billion people, And it's so ridiculous to be concentrating on climate change when no one's saying anything about the population growth. One of the problems is we have about 3 billion people who are really poor in this world. They want to raise their standard of living. If they start using fossil fuels like we have, well, the whole world will be destroyed even quicker.
So do you think this is like a sort of economic pyramid scheme by having more people? Like it's easy to have economic growth when you add more people to the mix?
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's a Ponzi scheme. And one of the problems is that our economic system, the one I've done so well out of, requires perpetual growth. Now, that's impossible. It's a finite world. So one day there'll be a major correction and we'll have to live within our means. That doesn't seem to be happening in the immediate future, but it will in the long-term future.
Now, when you were growing up and when your dad was doing business and various things, what was the interest rate back then? Is it natural to have about 1 or 2, 3% interest? Is that the actual, like the 70s and the 80s, that was really weirdly high interest, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when I sold Dick Smith Electronics, must have been nearly over 30 years ago, the interest rate we were getting in the bank was 18%.
Wow.
And someone who tried to borrow money was paying 28%.
Wow.
So absolutely staggering. I don't quite understand now with the interest rate being so low. I think it's moving us towards some enormous collapse. Because at the moment, the government just lowers the interest rate and that means we can keep growing when it's impossible.
Oh, well, you can't go much below zero.
Oh, you can. In fact, amazing, in Japan, you actually have to pay to put your money in the bank. So they are below zero. They're in minus rates of interest. Isn't that amazing?
Amazing. As far as population control, is there any country in the world that is what you would consider best practice into maybe looking into their growth of their population?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of countries. First of all, I don't believe in population control at all. What I've said is that we need to have a population plan. I've always said parents should have the number of children they can give a good life to. We don't have a problem from birth rate in Australia. It's because of enormous immigration. But first of all, what countries are showing the way? Japan is going from 120 million to 90 million by 2050. Italy is dropping its population, even though it's Catholic. Obviously, they don't take any notice of the Pope.
Fair enough.
In Germany, the population is basically stabilised. So there are some very good examples in the world. In the developed world, we're the worst possible example. We have a growth rate of 1.6% per year, which is going to take us to 100 million people at the end of this century, when our grandkids will be alive. Now, no one believes 100 million is a sensible number for Australia.
Well, yes, I mean, it'll be like Taiwan all along the east coast.
Yes, it will be, and we're an arid country, and it's probably possible to have 100 million, but we'll end up like the United States. They have 50 million people that are poor, that are on food stamps, that are on the dole. They can't provide enough jobs for 330 million. They've gone past the sweet point.
How do you feel about the universal allowance that everybody gets a certain amount of money from the government all the time regardless? How do you feel about that scheme?
Yes, the universal wage, I think we'll have to move to something like that. One of our problems is that since the Second World War, the growth we've had is by consuming more. Up until the Second World War, the growth was used to reduce working hours. Yes. But now what we do is the growth would end up with unemployment, so we keep people working long hours, but then we make more and more stuff. So if you go into a typical shopping centre, half the stuff there is rubbish, it's not needed, but if we stop buying it, the whole economy will collapse. You mentioned before, I mentioned a Ponzi scheme. That's what it is. So we need to learn to live within our means. It's one world. I'm told we use 1.8 times the world's resources every year now. Now, it's pretty obvious that can't go on for very long.
Yeah, and you've obviously spoken to a couple of politicians throughout your years. They just don't want to get into this. It's just it's a noodly, horrible box of worms, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Too hard. No, not even the Greens. The Greens don't have a population policy.
Really?
Absolutely no. It's too hard for politicians because if you start talking about population, number one, you've got to talk of giving people control of conception, because you go to Africa where the mothers are having 4 or 5 kids. They don't want 4 or 5, but there's no way they don't have contraception. So that's an important thing. We should be telling Australians, first of all, birth rate, we're okay, but we shouldn't be bringing in this huge number of immigrants all the time, because in the end, there won't be enough jobs. And when you end up with generations not having a job, that's a problem.
Yeah, and it's like, it's a difficult conversation to have, but someone should have the conversation, pick a number after wide consultation and stick with it. Is that what to do? Yeah?
I'm pro-immigration. It's what's made Australia such a fantastic place, but it's sensible numbers. Our long-term average has been 75,000 a year. If we went back to that, we'd stabilise our population at 30 million. That would be sensible.
Well, look, it's great talking to you again. And what are you the most interested in hearing Dr. Mann talk about tonight?
Well, I'm going to be interested. I've got lots of right-wing friends who are complete climate change deniers.
Hey, did you actually know Bob Santa Maria ever? Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't.
But he's a corker.
I'm sure he would have been a denier. Look, I'm not a person who has qualifications. I use common sense and I ask lots of advice, and I'm pretty well convinced that humans are affecting the climate and it's going to be all bad from here if we don't do something.
That's great talking to you again. Thank you for meeting tonight. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
Good to see you.
We're here with the President tonight, whose duty is to... What is your duty tonight? Have you got any?
Oh, yes, I am. I've been put to work by Tim, our Executive Officer, and I'm ticking the names off the list as people arrive.
About 70 people tonight, is it?
Yeah, really good turnout. Very happy with it.
Yeah. So he's one of the 97% of climatologists who do believe that the Earth is changing due to man-made efforts. Why do you think people are slow to accept this news or don't want to accept this news?
Well, I think it will entail major change and major planning, and not that it can't be done, but I think people are very, very resistant to that sort of change. And I was actually thinking about not a comparable situation, but a similar situation with the hole in the ozone layer.
Oh,
and,
yes.
and how once it was determined, it was accepted, and industry accepted it, and politicians accepted it, and steps were taken to phase out CFCs, and it was a no-brainer, and the necessary action was taken. And why this is so different is a bit of a mystery, really, but except that it's more complicated, and there are many, many more serious sort of industrial interests, such as the coal industry, working against it.
Yes, why do you think people are a bit slow to accept the climate science, or they just don't want to?
Look, I think there's so many different reasons. I think one of the big ones these days that's particularly pertinent at the moment is that there is a whole lot of alternative facts available to them. So people are, I guess, if they're that way inclined, or if somebody misinforms them and sets them on a trajectory of researching things online in that direction, then they'll be able to confirm those false, ideas and find the facts that support whatever.
Have you ever been looking up something and gone down the wrong rabbit hole online? I mean, I know with dietary stuff, I was sucked in for a while with the whole gluten thing, because I was reading it and went, oh, that makes sense, until I realised I was reading a page that was in no way scientific.
Yeah, I've been down the rabbit hole many times, many times. Fortunately, most of the time I'm able to claw my way back to reality, to the light. But, that's quite tricky sometimes. You actually need to be vigilant in the way that you, look at the information that's available. And if you're surrounded by other people who are also down that rabbit hole, then you're far less likely to be inclined to, to try to get out and look at, reality.
So people are always making fun of critical thinking, but never at any time, except maybe maybe the Middle Ages could have used a bit of it. But critical thinking is more important than ever now.
I think it's always been important, and there's always been different elements in society that have tried to suppress, people who do think critically and challenge the status quo. There's vested interests, there's people who don't want certain facts to come to light, and it's the eternal challenge to remain vigilant against those people and those tendencies.
Hi, Iran. Good to see you here today. It's a big night of politically charged climate action.
Well, it shouldn't be politically charged. It's a scientific question. People who make it political are wrong.
Yes, and which is what I've been asking people. Why do you think people are so slow to accept the scientific data, and why do you think they don't want to?
Well, it's a psychological question, I think, but I have some hypotheses about that. I think, first of all, because people don't want it to be true, because, the reality is hard, and I think people generally are not quick to accept difficult truths. The other thing is, you will find that most of the people who don't accept climate science tend to be older, and there might be a little bit of guilt in that, the kind of world that we've created and we are leaving our children is not as good as, for example, the previous generation has left us. So I think there is definitely an element of that. But in the end, I don't know that there is actually psychological research about that. So I don't know whether my hypothesis holds water or not.
A number of people have said that people don't trust experts as much because they feel they can do their own research on the web and that can lead them anywhere.
I actually think, first of all, I think it's a new phenomenon. Science is still, by and large, really trusted. I mean, there's surveys that are done about what kind of institutions do you trust, and scientific institutions and science in general. For example, scientists as a profession is generally very highly trusted in all the surveys around the world. So I don't think it's actually true that scientists are not trusted, or experts are not trusted, but they're definitely not trusted as much as they used to be. And I think actually the climate debate is part of that. I think it's a cause, not an effect here. What happened is that for political reasons, people are making it appear as if climate scientists have an agenda and they're not being honest. And I think that's creating that kind of less trust of experts, especially expertise in climate science.
Look, another issue you've been across, which is a bit different with the coronavirus, do you think the effect of that on the community might affect the anti-vax movement at all, either way?
No.
You think they'll still be sus of everything?
They'll find something. It's like a bit like the Mercury. Okay, so Mercury was taken out of vaccines in 2001, I think. Yeah. They're still talking about it as if it's there, or they found something else. No. They're against vaccines. They're not against something about the vaccines. They're against vaccines, and they'll find something. And of course, there's already the normal conspiracy theories going on around. It's manufactured. It's big pharma created it. The Chinese created it. Whatever. And I'm sure the anti-vaxxers will somehow feed into that.
Calling all Skeptic Zone listeners. Do you live in or near Glasgow, or are you planning to visit sometime? Then you're in luck, because the Glasgow Skeptics have got your Monday nights sorted. We're committed to filling up every available Monday night with talks on science and skepticism. Past speakers include Eugenie Scott, Jerry Coyne, Michael Marshall, Nate Phelps, Tom and Cecil from Cognitive Dissonance, PZ Myers, Richard Wiseman, AC Grayling, Noah Heath and Eli from The Scathing Atheist, Simon Singh, Rebecca Watson, and a multitude of local academics and skeptics. There's literally nothing better you can do on a Monday night in Glasgow that doesn't involve taking your clothes off. So come join us. We've also got a vibrant online community. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and get involved with the discussion. Glasgow Skeptics. Self-help for your brain.
Logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. they are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This week we'll look at straw man.
This is when we substitute a person's actual position or argument with a distorted, exaggerated, or misrepresented version of their position or point of view.
A straw man, or a figure made out of straw, is easy to burn down. It is far easier to attack something weak, even if it has nothing to do with what your opponent is trying to say, than to attack a strong argument.
She said she briefly saw something that appeared light and creepy, and she couldn't figure out what it was. Why would she resort to ghosts as an explanation?
The original person did not actually state that she thought she saw a ghost. Her point has been taken further and built up into something more extreme that is considered nonsense. It's much easier to just knock down a suggestion that a ghost appeared than to delve into the possible causes of what was experienced, especially if no explanations can be provided. By misrepresenting the original claim, it can then be dismissed outright rather than addressed.
The government is hiding the fact that aliens are living on Earth. That Air Force testing ranges are off limits and highly guarded is evidence that aliens are being held there.
Of course, the Air Force range is off limits and highly guarded. This is true no matter what country you're in. But this fact has nothing to do with whether or not aliens or anything else are being kept a secret.
You skeptics say you can test my psychic abilities, but your tests are impossible to pass. I never said I was 100% accurate.
This excuse from people claiming psychic powers in order to not be tested is one we've heard again and again over the decades. Skeptics never impose a condition of being 100% accurate in a test of paranormal powers. Our real position is that we will test someone based on what they say their success rate is. Maybe they only claim 75% accuracy. That's fine. We can test for that. By saying we insist on 100%, they are using a totally exaggerated and false condition of a test to make it appear that skeptics are unreasonable. Many so-called psychics will look for any excuse not to take the skeptic's challenge. But you might be interested to know that many people claiming to be water diviners, that is, to have the power to find underground water or metals using divining rods or pendulums, often claim to be 100% accurate. It can be tricky to tell when your opponent sets up a straw man to burn down. If you spot it, point out that what they are saying is not really representative of your point of view. As always, don't get too upset if you miss it. Logical fallacies can slip by anyone. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bickersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.
Alright, Dr. Paulie here. We've got our Skepticon 2020 conference committee meeting.
So just to start off, Sarah, remind me again, what are the dates of Skepticon this year?
23rd to the 25th of October 2020.
Oh, excellent. No, that's good. It's right towards the end of the year. And Simon, remind me, have we booked a venue for Skepticon?
We've booked a fantastic venue for this year's conference. We've got the Mantra on view, close to plenty of parking, and transport via the Gold Coast tram service almost to your door.
Excellent. And have you got the address for Mantra on View?
View Avenue, Surfers Paradise.
Fantastic. I guess that's why it's called Mantra on View. And Casey, so who have we got booked with respect to our speakers?
Well, it's early days, but we have confirmed Dr. Carl from the ABC.
Excellent.
He was very keen to come along. And our main international speakers are the famous skeptic podcasters, Skeptics with a K.
Awesome. And have we got all three coming along?
We've actually got all three coming along. The first time that all three of them have come to Australia. So coming all the way from the UK, so that's very exciting.
Excellent. That's really great. And Sarah, have we got somewhere for people to be able to look up information? We've got a website?
Our key website is www.gcskeptics.com/skepticon-2020.
Great. And is that our official website? Or?
No, the official website is still in the works.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll keep working on that in the background. Let's get to it.
Skepticon 2020, the Australian Skeptics National Convention, 23rd to the 25th of October 2020, Surfers Paradise, Queensland. For more information, visit www.gcskeptics.com/Skepticon-2020.
I think we need to think. Here's Susan Gerbic.
Hello, Skeptic Zone listeners. It is I, Susan Gerbic, here to give you updates on our fight against the paranormal. As you know, I run the amazing GSOW project. We are attempting to write and maintain all Wikipedia pages concerning science and the paranormal, and in all languages. Yes, we know, that is insane, but still we are continuing with the task. Today I'd like to tell you about two recent additions to English Wikipedia. The first is Shalom House, and that's spelled Shalom, and it was written by GSOW editor Aaron. This is the first time I've heard of Shalom House, but once I read Aaron's work, I was like, wow. So Shalom House is located north of Perth in Western Australia. It is a Christians men-only drug rehabilitation facility that was started in 2012 by a former meth addict and drug dealer with no medical training. It's a tough love center that forces residents to sign a power of attorney over to Shalom House, giving control of finances over to the group. At the beginning of treatment, the residents are not allowed cell phones, books, magazines, music, video, and cannot leave unaccompanied. They have to work full-time at the house and also volunteer at other charities. They're not allowed to swear. They do not have to be religious to attend, but they have to study the Bible and attend Christian services. A doctor visits once a week, but there is no doctor on site. Shalom does not keep statistics, and people who leave the program are not tracked to see if they relapse. The reason they do not keep track of statistics is because they are, quote, not trying to prove anything, unquote. A journalist named Sarah Brooks, keep in mind Australian Skeptics for a possible Barry Williams Award for good journalism. Sarah Brooks, writing for the community news group, did an investigation and found that of approximately 1,000 men that entered the program, only 49 completed it, which is a success rate of under 5%. The average rate of publicly funded services is 35%. Residents were required to sign up for a year, but the journalist discovered in some cases people were still in treatment 3 years later. The average time for publicly funded services is 1 to 3 months. What Aaron, the GSOW editor, discovered is that Shalom House has received 2 awards. One in 2017 from the Telstra Western Australian Charity, and in 2019 a Nonprofit of the Year award from My Business Awards. What Aaron discovered that prior to his rewrite of the Wikipedia page, someone editing with the username Shalom House had been editing the Wikipedia page. It was complete fluff until Aaron got involved and rewrote the entire Wikipedia page. And now I'm going to quote something Aaron wrote in the GSOW Secret Cabal. Quote, "What I'm coming to appreciate more and more about Wikipedia is the ability to have all of the relevant information on one page. It took me ages to find all the articles I used for the Shalom House page, far more time than Joe Average would put into finding out about it in an organization, meaning all of the nasty stuff slips through the cracks and goes unnoticed. I wonder if they would have won the awards they did if the judges had access to the information I've posted. Now Joe Average gets full disclosure with one click. But what really makes me happy is knowing that there are going to be parents of addicts who will now avoid Shalom House and hopefully get effective treatment instead." Unquote. Congratulations, Aaron. So the next Wikipedia page is dealing with a story I'm sure you've all read about on social media a few weeks ago. Do you remember the 4-year-old that was really sick with the flu and experiencing seizures, and the mother reached out to a Facebook group for advice? They told her to use breast milk, thyme, and elderberry. The child was later hospitalized and died. The Facebook group is run by Larry Cook, who is anti-vaccine and has no medical training. He is funded by donations and T-shirt and book sales. He raised more than $100,000 on a GoFundMe campaign. He also recommends anti-vaccine literature and receives the cuts of those sales. So while the story was all over social media and people were outraged over the death of this child and complaining that Facebook should not allow this kind of nonsense, GSOW editor Robin Canton decided he wanted to take action. In a few days, he had done his research and published a brand new Wikipedia page for everyone to find. The media often does not have the time to do the research, and with a well-written Wikipedia page, they can review the citations that Robin left them to find so they can fully understand this group, which is called Stop Mandatory Vaccination. Yes, that is its name. And it also has a website. The Facebook page has over 178,000 members. Folks, we have a lot of work to do. If you are sick and tired of this nonsense and are hoping to learn how to fight back, please join us. Training takes a few months, but you finish at your own pace. Once trained, you can contribute so much more than outrage on social media. What are you waiting for? We are waiting for you. Approach me on Facebook and I'll give you a pre-training assignment to complete to give you an idea of what to expect. If after completing that you decide to continue with training, you will join your peers in the secret cabal located in a private Facebook group. Now, how often do you get to join an actual cabal? Thanks, everyone.
Skeptics Cafe is held on the third Monday of every month at the Dan O'Connell Hotel in Melbourne. On Monday, March 16th, Chris Guest, president of the Vic Skeptics, examines the curious career of the acclaimed archaeologist James Mallard. In the middle of the 20th century, Mallard changed our understanding of the Neolithic period in Anatolia with amazing discoveries at Hadjila and Çatalhöyük. Controversies abounded when he documented the Dorak treasure, the Beyköy inscription, and discovered a continuity of fabric designs dating from the Neolithic era to modern times in Turkey. For more information, see the Skeptics Cafe Facebook page or the Vic Skeptics website at vicskeptics.wordpress.com/events.
Life is wild. With Michelle Franklin.
Hi guys, I just wanted to give you a heads up that the sound quality of my report might be a bit off this week. We're finally getting some much needed rain in the north and it's woken up some of the creatures that are usually a bit more quiet. So my apologies, but I'm sure you won't mind a few background insects and maybe the occasional frog chorus. Today I want to talk to you about invasive species, which means any organism that is moved to a new location and which possesses traits that allow it to then invade and move into new areas unassisted. And in this context, I'm also going to include the factor that it causes harm in the new environment. Now, before I get too far into this, I need to acknowledge that we are an invasive species and we've spread across the planet and caused a lot of damage, so that's just something that we're going to have to accept. But accepting that an invasive species is here doesn't mean that we have to accept the damage that it will cause in the future. We can and do, with varying levels of success, take steps to try to reduce the impact that humans have on the world. We exclude people from vulnerable areas and we place restrictions on human activities to reduce impacts like polluting and over-consuming resources. And in some places we even try to reduce population growth by limiting reproduction. It's the same when we manage invasive animals and plants. We may have to accept that some of them are here to stay and we can't get rid of them all, but just because we can't prevent something entirely doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reduce the harm. Invasive species have done a lot of damage throughout history and there are a lot of them out there, but it doesn't mean we should just give up and accept the situation because there's a lot more damage left to be done and we can prevent some of it. The example that I want to use today is horses in Kosciusko National Park. And the reason that I want to use this example is because it demonstrates how invasive species can change the dynamic of an ecosystem and how it responds to major disturbance. Horses have been in Australia for 230 years, and for about 160 of those years they've been recognised as a feral invasive species. There was a time when we relied on the horses through pioneer and explorer days, through wars and fires and droughts, and of course they're beautiful and charismatic and fun to ride, so who can blame us for adopting them into our culture and writing poems about them? Also for context, about a third of Kosciusko National Park has recently burned in the devastating bushfires that ripped through the southern parts of Australia. Now, fire's not necessarily a bad thing. Ecosystems rely on intermittent small disturbances to maintain their biodiversity. When there's no disturbance, the strongest and most dominant species outcompete the others, and the less competitive pioneer species don't have any room to grow. If there's too much disturbance, however, it might knock out all the species at the same time. The balance of an ecosystem relies on intermittent small disturbances, which knock back the dominant species without removing them all, and makes room for pioneer species to spread and breed. It's a constant fluctuation between competitive dominant species and invasive pioneer species, with the end result that we have a biodiverse environment with a range of species that can thrive in a wide range of conditions. This biodiversity, or diverse range of life, is what gives an ecosystem its resilience against change. If all the animals or plants were the same and only adapted to one specific set of conditions that is present at the moment, then when a fire or something like that does happen, it would have the potential to knock out the entire system. Small disturbances often come in the form of fires or floods, and when this disturbance subsides, there's space left in the landscape for the pioneer species to take hold for a while, and the ecosystem can recover and start another cycle. But if the disturbance is too big, or if you add in multiple disturbances close together, like a bad fire season followed by flooding, in those cases the recovery can be difficult and slow. And this can also be impacted by an ever-increasing large invasive population of heavy, hard-hooved and high-consuming herbivores. In 2014, horse numbers in the whole of the Australian Alps were estimated to be a little over 9,000, of which 6,000 were in the Kosciusko National Park. At that time, the Kosciusko National Park Plan of Management provided the legal guidance for the management of feral horses, and it required the distribution and abundance of feral horses to be reduced and populations to be eradicated wherever feasible. Aerial surveys were repeated in 2019, and they found that the total number of horses in the Alps had actually increased to over 25,000, with 19,000 in Kosciusko. This came shortly after the Kosciusko Wild Horse Heritage Bill came into effect in 2018 for the purpose of establishing a wild horse heritage management plan, which will identify the heritage value of sustainable wild horse populations and set out how that heritage value will be protected. Keeping in mind that horses are big, most of them are fast enough to run away when fires approach, and there's a reasonable chance that their numbers are still at about this same level following the recent fires. Many of them are now likely to be starving to death. This means that when they've consumed all the resources that are left in their regular home range, they'll move out in search of new habitats within the already devastated ecosystems of Kosciusko National Park that are trying to recover. Now, as an example, consider the northern Corroboree frog, a critically endangered native frog that lives in the few remaining delicate sphagnum bog habitats in the Kosciusko National Park. They were on the brink of destruction already due to climate change, feral animal impacts, and most significantly, the devastating effects of the chytrid fungus, which has all but wiped them out. Wild populations were estimated to be less than 50 individuals at one point, but captive breeding programs combined with small-scale horse exclusion fencing has had some success in recovering their numbers. The New South Wales Threatened Species Scientific Committee has listed habitat degradation and loss caused by feral horses as a key threatening process under Schedule 4 of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act. These horses are destroying many of the bog communities, which are not evolved to cope with heavy, hard-hooved animals. The horses are stirring up sediment and defecating in the precious remaining water. The hooves are compacting soils, causing erosion and vegetation loss in the soft grounds and creek lines, and now they're also starving to death, over-consuming the limited remaining resources and spreading out to invade new areas. What happens when this now protected and hungry population of horses moves into the last remnants of suitable Corroboree frog habitat, creates erosion and runoff channels which drain the swamplands, tramples and destroys the sphagnum moss and other vegetation that the frogs require for nesting, and forces them to lay their eggs in areas that put them at risk of desiccation, undermining the significant efforts that have gone into breeding and reintroducing them into the wild. What's even the point of having protected areas such as Kosciusko National Park if we legislate to allow it to be overrun with a feral invasive species which is recognised as a key threatening process? And what's the point of having breeding programs for our critically endangered native animals when we won't protect the few remaining places that we have left to release them? So the situation right now is that there are a lot of highly disturbed and vulnerable ecosystems out there with reduced numbers of endangered and critically endangered species. Those who managed to survive the fires so far are now competing with large numbers of protected horses that are moving through the landscape and destroying as they go. So the situation right now is that there are a lot of highly disturbed and vulnerable ecosystems out there with reduced numbers of endangered and critically endangered species. Those who managed to survive the fires so far are now competing with large numbers of protected horses that are moving through the landscape, consuming and destroying as they go. So what's the answer? We can build food stations and shelters for the endangered species, but what's to stop the horses from capitalising on these resources and continuing to outcompete the smaller animals? Wild harvest of horses was used in the past, and it can take some animals out of the wild and make use of them. Sterilisation is another option, but like wild harvest, it's a slow and expensive and relatively small-scale solution. Aerial culling is a real and viable option, and many have supported that since long before this most recent fire event. It's able to be deployed at a much broader scale than live harvest or sterilisation, and it's significantly more cost-effective. The good news is that since I wrote this report a month ago, I've now learned that the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service plans to remove up to 4,000 horses from the most sensitive areas of Kosciusko. In my opinion, that's a really good start. Although 4,000 out of 19,000 is not a big portion of them. And I'm worried about how long it'll take if they try to catch everyone alive and remove it. Will they be able to do it in time for it to make much difference to the frogs? And remember that horses are just one example that I chose to demonstrate this point. Multiply this impact out to all the invasive species that we have in this country and try to imagine the impact on our unique ecosystems of deer and goats, pigs, rabbits, cats, foxes, dogs, donkeys, camels, buffalo, toads, and all the different fish and birds and insects and plants, as well as human activity and, of course, horses. So when you see arguments around ecosystem management, ask yourself, how do you think we should best proceed, keeping in mind the potential that these invasive species have to impact on our ecosystems in the event of all the major disturbances that will come in the future.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. Next week, it's the welcome return of the Book of Tim. Tim Mendham only dropped by the studio the other day to record some more Book of Tim. We're going to kick off with a 3-part story about water divining, about, when was it? 2013, a major water divining test. So that's a bit of good old-fashioned skepticism. Also next week, more from Skepticon 2019 with Maynard, and undoubtedly something covering the current worldwide situation. Despite these challenging times that face us all, I still appreciate very much and still vital to the Skeptic Zone that people keep contributing with PayPal or Patreon. Maybe the Skeptic Zone is a welcome relief from some of the news going around at the moment. Maybe it's still keeping you company on your walks or your long drives or your commute. I'm very grateful for everybody who contributes to the Skeptic Zone. And I've said this for years, and it's true. Without your support, there would be no Skeptic Zone. As simple as that. So thank you very much. Go to www.skepticzone.tv and click the Patreon link. In fact, I'll tell you that one of the consequences of the worldwide situation at the moment is the Australian dollar continues to dive, and which means that if you're contributing to the show from the United States in US dollars on Patreon or PayPal, your contribution suddenly is worth a lot more. I think the dollar is hovering around 62 cents at the moment. So if you're chipping in for $5 a week, that $5 is magically transformed into almost 10. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders wishing you all very well, signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter @SkepticZone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
Hello, people who listen after the music. Let's play the dice game. So wash your hands. I think that's the advice to do whatever we're doing these days. Wash your hands, and we'll play the dice game. For those who don't know, I roll a 10-sided die 3 times, and you use your psychic powers or your dumb luck or whatever the hell you want to do. Some people actually have Skeptic Zone 10-sided dice. When I'm giving talks and I'm out and about, I wash my hands and I give people souvenir 10-sided dice so they can play along. So if you're one of those people, let's play along. Here we go. The first number this week is 7. Now, I don't have a Skeptic Zone pen. Maybe I should, when this is all over. Anyway, remember that 7. I usually write it down, but I seem to be penless. Right? And the next number, 4. 7 and 4. Okay, guess the last one. Here we go. Last number this week is 6. 746. There's a message there for us all.